I'm going to be talking about purpose alignment. And this is kind of an interesting topic because it's one of these words, alignment, that oftentimes we talk about, but we really don't define clearly on what we mean. It's thrown out, and we also basically assume that others are talking about the same point of view. Even when you do the research, there's not really a lot on what's available on talking about alignment. I'll get into this a little bit, but I'm going to focus on why the alignment, who's involved or who could be involved, what do you align and how. So I'm going to focus it from different perspectives that way. Give me a second. Give me a second. I got troubles. Okay, here we go. Okay, so let's talk about alignment then. And I'm going to put it within the perspective of a leadership concept called DAC leadership, direction, alignment, commitment. And this is a higher order leadership model. When you study leadership, historically, it's been from many different perspectives. Early on, leadership was studied from a characteristics and a personality standpoint. It's been studied from a situational standpoint, from the leader and even from the follower perspective. Sometimes it's focused as a leadership, as a dynamic between the leaders and the followers and how things are accomplished. But increasingly, when we started getting into more team activities, many of those leadership constructs started to really break down. So for example, in a team where the leadership may be shared, dependent upon the different expertise of the team members, none of the leadership models really held up well. Similarly, sometimes the leadership might be participatory, where people are more involved in decision-making at different times and they kind of float in and out. And then there's also a shared perspective of leadership. In response to that, a higher order model was developed called DAC, Direction, Alignment, Commitment. And this is more of a functional model of leadership, in that all leadership models will also fall under this construct, in that for effective leadership, you need some direction, you need alignment for that direction, and the people must be committed. So therefore, if you focus on the three different functional areas, leadership basically evolves. Now, this is more of a leadership development construct than it is a leader development, because there's many things you can do to set direction, alignment, gain commitment that aren't necessarily focused just by the person that may be leading the group. So it's a different way of thinking about leadership. In this way, then, let's talk about the functional view, and that it's not necessarily leader-follower dependent, because there are things you can do within the organization that helps establish the direction, establish alignment, and how to get people committed and engaged in their work. It also then fits more with the leadership than it is a leader construct. So focusing on the different components then, there's an awful lot that's actually developed for direction, how to get the agreement for the purpose, that what the vision is, the mission statement, even down to strategy. Books and whole business courses have been developed around direction. Alignment then comes into where we're going to focus on here. And this is, I'm going to come at it from different perspectives, but let me talk about just as a coordination effort for the knowledge and the work. It basically puts the direction together across the organization such that people are working together. And then you get into individual commitment at the work level. This is where people are willing to subordinate their personal interest in favor of the group. So I'm going to be focusing just on the alignment. As I said, there's been a lot developed in the past for direction, And similarly, there's been an awful lot developed for commitment, how to engage employees. The whole area of human resources oftentimes focuses on the relationships, getting people involved, getting people committed, not necessarily for compliance alone. So in both of those areas, there's a lot been developed, but on the alignment alone, not so much so. To the extent that what I'm going to be presenting today isn't so much a hard and fast of here's what it is, here's how to do it in detail. I'm going to basically put together what might be a pathway of discovery of my thinking on alignment and what I've seen other people talk about it. And part of this comes from a series of discussion starters I did last month. That was here and a few different LinkedIn discussion groups. And I basically posted a general question on alignment and asked their opinions about it from the who, what, why, how, perspective. And what I got back was, for the most part, pretty superficial and pretty much what I probably would have said without really thinking about it. And I didn't see a lot of real in-depth thought on the topic. So what I'm presenting today then is, like I said, my route to discovery and what I'm thinking about alignment relative to how organizations are evolving and how you gain alignment when you start moving away from a traditional command and control hierarchy. Alignment then can be looked at from different perspectives. And one is a formal way, how you organize the structure itself, the work processes, who's involved, the flows there, the planning process. As we've talked about before, the performance management system, how you do your controls and rewards. Oftentimes, these are formal mechanisms that are really structural in many ways that tries to gain alignment across the organization. And what is being aligned is embedded in these different structures that we build. There's also an informal of how actions are oftentimes coordinated among team members or even people across the organization that are working in the informal organization. They see some commonality. They are basically putting their efforts together in a mutual adjustment process so that they see really opportunities to work together better than working individually. So this is kind of an informal alignment process that is happening all the time. There's also some new thinking, and this is kind of a mix of the two formal approaches, but it's actually a little bit more explicit. Okay, and part of this gets into, for example, Kotter's dual operating system. Kotter's dual operating system has a traditional command and control hierarchy, but in a shadow organization behind that, what he calls the dual operating system, is really a formalization of the informal network that's always in place. It's the development of cross-organization teams on an ad hoc basis to handle alignment and problem issues, such that the command and control hierarchy is not really changed at all, but it is complemented with some explicit adjustments being done in the informal organization. Part of this also gets into what Reg and I have been talking about with purpose alignment team. This at the extreme level of what we are basically proposing organizations could become is a separate functional level of an organization that connects the governance, top side of an organization to a networks of work teams. This is a set of really the people that convene and pull the information together, make sure that things are done without necessarily directing those operations. This can also be done as a similar to the dual operating system as an ad hoc team. such that you're building a cross-organization team specifically for the purpose alignment to help the organization do the minor adjustments so they don't have to wait for the major reorganizations. So that as a transitional stage, you can put a purpose alignment team in place within a hierarchy. There's also some talk about the double loop learning. It's not just so much the adjustments to stay on track, but it's the questioning of the practices themselves and what needs to be changed at the core level, so that the purpose alignment then is not so much that it is keeping things on track together across the organization, but also questioning the application of how the purpose is actually put into place and how the people are doing their job. So it's an explicit thought process on double loop learning. And part of this also then is how to subject this alignment to routine adjustment. Too often in a traditional organization, if you put that alignment into a performance management system, you're really locking that in probably for a year's time or with minor modifications quarterly. Rarely anything more frequent than that, other than waiting for the next reorganization cycle to come around. So we're starting to think about alignment differently across an organization. But we also need to talk a little bit about some of the assumptions that we bring. In the past, there's been a general assumption about a stable environment. Change is episodic. We generally suppress the pressures for change until we can no longer suppress them. And then we do a planned change that often involves some type of structural reorganization. What we try to do then is establish an alignment as a synchronization across an organization, assuming that once things are synchronized, same as a machine might be put online, that then will continue until something breaks. And oftentimes that's what happens. We put a process in place, we assume it will run until all of a sudden we find out it doesn't run, and then we take it offline and reorganize. Today, though, we're getting more into the volatile, the uncertain, chaotic, and even ambiguous environment, in that we can't often assume stability. We're dealing with change more as a routine adjustment, routine adaptation that requires more explicit sensing all the time and a dynamic reaction to that. This then really sets us back of having to think differently about the organization and how things are put in place and how long they can be put in place without necessarily thinking about the minor adjustments. We can no longer think that we're going to get it right the first time. We have to have an assumption that minor adjustments can be made as we learn more and as we find out that things that we thought were going to be aren't that the case. Okay. So we're going to talk then about the impact of alignment, the why part. We're also going to be talking a little bit about the what, how, and who. Okay. And again, this is kind of my perspective as I've wandered through my thought process. So going forward then, why is alignment essential? Well, if you think about this rowing team here, if they were not coordinating their activities together, there would be no way that they would possibly win the race. They have to be in perfect alignment. And in this case, there's actually a particular person in the front of the boat that has just that job, gaining alignment through calling out the activities of the rowers. So then within a VUCA environment, we've got the need for alignment. Without that, the silos would develop. Even with an attempt for cross-organization alignment, silos will develop just because of the command and control hierarchy that the structure presents. That then creates a sub-optimization, and to the extent that the performance management system does not anticipate or address the sub-optimization, those silos are allowed to gain even more power and work at cross currents within the organization itself. The why then also gets into the area of a shared understanding. The issue of connecting direction to commitment, the ability for people to have a common understanding, the sense-making process that is needed across the organization that also feeds upward into the direction setting itself, such that the direction can be modified going forward. So that the shared understanding then is a combination of cross-organization sense-making as well as a coordination of that direction as it is being pushed down into the organization itself. Okay. Any questions at this point? Let me go ahead then and jump into what needs alignment. This is something that I hadn't really thought about in any type of detail of what needs alignment, because we just basically assume that things are aligned. Almost by definition, though, Reg and I talk about purpose alignment. Part of this is the clarification, the cross-organization communication of that. And implied in that also is how value is to be achieved relative to that purpose. This can be thought of as strategy. This is the sustainability aspect, in that purpose has to have some sustainability element to it to be successful. So there's some need across the organization to gain that type of clarification and the direction and understanding of that. So there's need then in purpose alignment for sure. Okay. We also basically assume in many cases that there's a need for work process alignment. A lot of times we think this is happening. We establish performance management systems to try to force it to happen by putting some boundaries and direction, for that. But oftentimes it gets lost within the silos, the sub-optimization, the different, not only work processes, but the different operating styles or behaviors. I don't necessarily like to use culture change, but a lot of times when people talk about culture change is really a misalignment of behaviors across the organization. Sometimes a misalignment between different work units, other times a misalignment between the work unit activity and what is needed for the purpose accomplishment. So there's a number of things here that need to be aligned also associated with getting the work done. There's also aspects of the communication process of information. A lot of times the hierarchy is really responsible for the up and down communication protocols, to the extent that a cross-organization communication is needed. That's generally handled informally through the informal network of people knowing somebody who knows what they need to know, or vice versa, and swapping that information. With increasing amount of information and information flows, there's a trend toward more transparency of information, but also with that comes some need for filtering, such that you have available to you the information when you need it, but at the same time to keep from getting bombarded with too much when you don't need it. So it's a combination then of how do you gain alignment in the communication process of information such that people know what's available when they need to know it. And this is another alignment issue that I hadn't thought about until I started really getting into thinking about alignment, and that is time horizons. The alignment of decisions across time periods. Oftentimes, we solve the symptoms, but that's a short-term thinking. We're addressing the immediacy of the problems and the impact it's having on the organization. And because of those symptoms, we're dealing with it rapidly. When we do a core analysis of the problem, a lot of times what we find out, though, is that we've got a long-term problem. So we then have the challenge then of operating across multiple time horizons. And how do you align those activities such that you're addressing the long-term problem on one hand, but at the same time, you're dealing with the short-term symptoms of that long-term problem. So it's not just a short-term problem, nor is it just a long-term problem, but it's a mix of both time horizons that are impacting your decision-making in today's present period, such that some alignment is then needed, at least in the thinking process of how these time horizons are at play. So that's kind of one I hadn't thought about before, but when you take a look at many of the problems organizations have, particularly in the area of politics, if you take a look at global political issues, they are constantly coming up with solutions that are ignoring the different time horizons and how those time horizons are interacting. And many times when you listen to conflicting arguments, both sides are correct, but they're arguing at different time horizons. So this is where explicit recognition needs to be made of how to align time itself in decision-making. Shifting then into what needs alignment, there's also the interpersonal conflicts, the opinions that people have, and how you address them so that they don't basically sit in the background and create conflicts down the road. This is part of a sensing process, but it also becomes a little bit more explicit because without alignment of those potential conflicts, the traditional silos will continue to exist, and people within those silos will reflect those opinions because of their identity within those different groups. Shifting then in from what needs alignment, let's talk about who is involved in the alignment. Traditionally, this is really in the management hierarchy itself, the positional power. This is the entire purpose in many ways of the middle management, of getting that alignment from the direction of the top of the organization down to the people that are actually doing the work lower in the organization. The question then comes is this really needed when there's alternate ways of communicating direction, and the people that are lower in the organization, once they understand the overall purpose and their part to play in it, to what extent does that command and control hierarchy still play a requirement in the process, or can it be done in different ways? So when we take a look then of what we need now, let's look at alternatives to who might be involved, okay? And goes right to the heart of that purpose alignment. How do you gain cross-organization? And to some extent, when I think about this, most organizations spend an awful lot of time of fighting fires. Okay. When there's a post-mortem of an organization that died, went out of business, or was forced into an acquisition situation, oftentimes what comes out of that post-mortem study is that they failed to do some of the critical things that they needed to do because they were too busy fighting fires. By setting up a separate approach on purpose alignment, you can then kind of split that explicitly apart so that the work units can deal with those fires. But at the same time, some people are removed from the firefighting so they can look at the fire prevention. So this is a different way of thinking and splitting the functions themselves such that alignment becomes a little bit more explicit and doesn't get really subsumed by the other operational aspects of the company. Okay. When you look then at the functions, okay, there's a number of critical functions that are at play here. And one comes from Peter Block with his book on community and much of what he's done with his consulting. And this is the power of convening. And this is often overlooked, of the ability to pull people together to address a common issue. That's the power of convening. And just by bringing them together, you're creating something new. This is them really talking about something that otherwise might have been ignored or in isolated parts of the organization, such that when purpose alignment comes into play, then there is a critical aspect on pulling people together and giving them space in to talk about that common issue. A closely related aspect to that then is network weaving. This is purposely building that network of networks, which is not only an informational connection, but a resources. And in resources here, it may be the physical resources, knowledge resources, but even more important, the people themselves, connecting them so that they are basically a formalization of what is needed in the informal to get the formal work done. This is the network weaving component. Reg also yesterday talked about coalition power. This really comes somewhat from the convening aspect, but when you've got a group of people together, there is something that is different. Okay. And oftentimes we talk about this, but we really don't understand it. In that we will say that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But if that's the case, what's the difference between the whole and the sum of the parts? And this is where I'm starting to think that this is the coalition power. And that when you pull the people together and you end up with something more than them working individually, this is something that oftentimes we assume, but we don't explicitly understand and work to harness. This is a critical aspect then on how we go forward to better utilize teams and that network. Okay. We can also do the interim structures. Many times when alternate structures are put in place, they are driven by startups or a crisis situation with a charismatic leader who comes in and makes a dramatic transformation. Without a startup, if you're dealing with a mature organization and lacking a true crisis, it's very difficult to transition to many alternate structures without thinking of something as an interim step. And that's one of the things that Reg and I keep trying to think about, of not only the end state, but how do you bridge that end state? Because without that necessary bridge, you're relating the necessity then of waiting for a crisis or a replacement with a startup. And a dual operating system oftentimes can be used as a interim step on how to build something that is complementary, that can take some of the formal functions without totally disrupting the existing structure that's in place, but as it assumes some of the additional operations, it can then slowly move away from the traditional command and control more toward the network. So as an interim level, a dual operating system can play a part there. Shifting then into the how component. Okay. Traditional command and control basically assumes that there's going to be some stability that is periodically disrupted with change. You are assuming that the alignments that are put in place through the traditional hierarchical relationships, through the performance management system, will remain at least for a year. That's basically the minimum level, but there's some level that's going to be remaining forever, knowing that there's going to be some need to change that at some point. And generally, those forces for change are suppressed until they can't be suppressed any longer, and you've got those very disruptive reorganizations that oftentimes sets the organization back as the chairs are moved around, so to speak. Okay. There's also within the traditional command and control an explicit delegation of authority. And this is can be thought of also as empowerment. Empowerment, though, has two perspectives. The traditional thought of empowerment is that it is something that is granted to you. Okay, that's a traditional delegation thought of empowerment. An alternate point of empowerment is a boundary testing. Okay, and I worked in one organization that was really successful. Our department had an operating procedure of it's better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission. And we operated on that. And we were dramatically successful operating and did a great number of changes with that testing, because a lot of times people will assume that they're more constrained than they actually are because they don't test their boundaries. But the hierarchy itself and the delegation process really discourages that, because the explicit component is a downward empowerment process. It's not a testing process. Okay. The performance management system then also has to align with the strategy, and this is then locked in for that reporting period until the next strategy or operations review happens. And even the strategic planning cycle on an annual basis, rarely does it really rethink the purpose or the strategy to a great extent. To most companies, it's basically a rubber stamp of dusting off the old and continuing going forward with that. Looking then at a dynamic approach, it's not just a top-down, which might be strategy-driven, but also a bottom-up, customer-driven approach. It's thinking of alignment as more dynamic, more routine, an adaptive approach, not a disruptive approach. And this can be done through a number of structural aspects. We mentioned the network weaving earlier, the establishment of new connections across the organization. And just by establishing those connections, you formalize what may have been informal or been needed, or you create new opportunities just because you're putting people together that hadn't been together before. You can also do an internal contracting approach. And this is what Hire Group does. Hire Group has over 4,000 micro enterprises operating as standalone entities, each with its own profit and loss statement. Now, that can only be accomplished with information transparency and some type of internal contracting, such that the micro enterprises can operate in some type of alignment so that they can collectively produce the desired organization purpose. Now, without that internal contracting, there might be kind of like a soft relationship. But again, it's still a kind of an ongoing process of communicating needs, where the contracting that Hire uses really comes into full advantage is when an opportunity for change is discovered. Oftentimes, when you're looking at a large organization, the change impacts multiple parts of the organization unevenly. Some parts of the organization may incur additional cost, while other parts may have lower cost or increased revenues. So a dynamic internal contracting approach is needed to basically come to a common understanding that the change is needed, but how to share those benefits. Many people have been talking about improving organizations using the higher microenterprise component. There's actually one consulting company I'm aware of now that is full-time advocating going to the higher microenterprise approach. They, however, really aren't focusing that much on the internal contracting component. Higher mentions that they've got contract templates for use when a new microenterprise is established. So they've got something internally, but they don't talk about their process of contracting. And when you try to find out, you get dramatic pushback immediately of that being proprietary. So they're very open with the microenterprise, but they are treating their contracting process as highly confidential. And I could see that because that's what makes those microenterprises work. But again, if you've got a dynamic system that allows either party to call into the relationship of should it be adjusted, particularly as you do an internal P&L statement for each individual unit, the internal contracting process can be done, but it needs a couple precursors, not only an alignment process that's dynamic, but also transparency to know how the benefits are shared. There's also then that there's a need for confirmation that the issues are being addressed. Oftentimes the alignment identifies variances, but they don't really give any kind of confirmation that those variances are being addressed in a meaningful way, such that when you're doing alignment within a traditional organization, you might be doing your monthly performance review meetings, and there may be a little bit of kicking around the table, a little fighting around the table. But for the most part, it's not until the variances get big enough that action is really taken. In this case, I'm talking about a more dynamic approach that's looking at the variances, seeing whether they are a trend or just a outlier that particular reporting time, but some attention's being addressed to it, or at least being watched. There's also some dynamic need for alignment of the resources, particularly if conflicts occur. Reg yesterday was talking about the projects. Projects are often managed within a matrix structure currently. Those projects, though, have different priorities, different resource needs. And even within a matrix structure, a lot of arguments and conflicts will occur to fight over different priorities and how those resources are best utilized. This then can be handled as a separate function such that they are discussed more openly, and some agreements are made as to how the purpose of the organization then is supported through resource allocation. Okay, this is different components of how alignment can be achieved. It also then gets into how it might be measured. Okay. Traditionally, we mentioned the performance management system, and this is where the goals are pushed down that link up to the higher level objectives. These are established within the performance management system to connect the strategy to operations. They are, to a large extent, codified within the budgets themselves and how the budgets are being managed. The targets, though, are somewhat static with an annual update process in a traditional organization. They also assume some independence of branches within the organization of the performance tree. And this is where the silos start to come in play, and where many of the failures within performance management come to the forefront, because there's conflicts within the different parts of the organization such that the actions needed in one part of the organization are not aligned elsewhere, and the conflicts then gets into a sub-optimization not only within a particular silo, but across the entire organization because there's internal fighting themselves. When you push down the targets into the organization, most of the times they're just pushed down. As they're pushed down through the branches of the organization, little effort is spent to go back and look at conflicts between the branches of the organization. This is what we're calling here the performance tree itself. Doesn't have any type of process for examination. The variance identification then is a critical component, but more importantly then is the convening of a response to it, such that the variances are explicitly recognized, tracked, and addressed. This is what's needed more increasingly in a dynamic alignment process. This requires not only monitoring, but also communicating the principles in action, the coaching, such that the organizations are doing what's needed to be done in a meaningful way. It's the identification of the conflicts and the resolving of those. And those conflicts may be across the organization in different ways. It may be between individuals, different departments, different work groups, different projects. This gets into the challenge then of not really having a fixed structure, because the projects, the people, how they're working together is always moving around, and the network weaving then is really making that more explicit. But as that network is woven, those conflicts need to be addressed in an explicit manner. And these then are really oftentimes overlooked within a performance management system. The outcome then of an integrated team is looking at the principles and the purpose. Okay, in this case, the purpose is the overall direction, and the principles might be considered as the boundaries of how that operation is put into place. The holistic view then is really looking at the alignment of a balancing for the inter-unit contracting, such that things are operating together in a, doesn't necessarily need to be a seamless way, but those seams are identified and addressed and not left to be ignored until they become a problem that can no longer be ignored. When we then look at alignment in a summary point, this is rethinking alignment more dynamically versus a static command and control alignment process. Okay, it's an attempt to try to avoid the reactive firefighting by thinking ahead of what the problems are, resolving them, working at different time horizons. This is a rethinking then of the leadership, a self-organizing approach based upon leadership not as a positional power, but as a functional of direction, alignment, commitment together that supports distributed decision-making. The alignment then is the linkage between the direction and the commitment itself. Okay. When you look at this group of ballet students, okay, there's an alignment that's happening from a direction of the teacher, but there's also alignment within the students themselves of watching each other. Someone who may be a little unsure of themselves will be watching what others are doing and making adjustments accordingly, such that you then have an overall direction, but you also have an internal alignment process that is active and underway. Even at a performance level, the direction will be off to the side, and all activities on the stage will be coordinated among the different ballet dancers, such that their position relative to others are understood and expected. To the extent that something happens, for example, a fall or a set modification, any number of things of an equipment failure, that the students themselves will no longer have the ability to take direction, but they will understand the overall purpose and will be able to react accordingly as an informal alignment among themselves to get back to where they need to be, such that the performance itself goes on, but it may not necessarily go on perfectly as planned because the minor little imperfections are being addressed in a dynamic way. We're also talking about the need for transitioning. Okay. And this is a critical component because too often when people propose a new way of organizing, okay, they talk about the end state without realizing the extreme gap that sometimes exists between that end state and the current operations. So most organizations, I'm talking about larger, historical, mature organizations, they have a hierarchical performance management system that is in place. Okay. That is increasingly running into struggles to deal with a dynamic changing environment. Okay. If you were to think, though, about an interim state of a dual operating system with a purpose alignment team, that then allows you to more dynamically think about alignment, address those issues, the issues that a top-down command and control have difficulty dealing with. This dual operating system or performance alignment team focuses more explicitly on that alignment that oftentimes is ignored. And then over time, you can go to a full rethinking of the structure itself, to a performance alignment team and a 3-level DAC functional structure. Okay. Questions at this time? As I said earlier, there's not a lot really written on alignment. This is kind of what I've kind of discovered along the route in my thinking on it.
Okay.
Your thoughts?
Ernie, so in your conversations to develop this deck, and this is a really great deck, so thanks for presenting this. We often talk about alignment. We also talk about diversity. Or I think of alignment as being homogeneity, everybody, as you say, rowing in the same direction. But then you've got this balance or the challenge of being heterogeneity, where you want the diversity, because if you don't have the diversity, the organism will die, right? It won't be able to mutate and keep going.
Yeah.
So how do you address that then?
Yep. I was thinking about that this morning too. Alignment doesn't mean everyone exactly the same. It doesn't mean everyone in a straight line. That line may curve. It may have parallel lines. And too often when we think about, diversity is an interesting topic. Okay. Too often diversity is a legal construct. And I prefer not to use diversity from that perspective. I like to think of diversity as different mental models that each individual brings because of their prior experiences. Okay. Such that if you've got diversity of thinking, that can lead then to conflicts, different ways of sensing, different ways of viewing the situation. That doesn't necessarily mean that alignment is not possible. Alignment then becomes a dynamic effort to look for commonality, looking for how to maybe synchronize, get things working together, but at the same time, be aware of what is truly needed for that alignment at that particular point in the organization at that particular time, and what may be allowed to exist as a slightly different one-off for localized needs.
I think in yesterday's presentation by Reg, we briefly touched upon about respecting outliers. Those people that maybe they see the weak signals, and how do we appreciate, respect them as opposed to saying, come on guys, get aligned, get with the program. Then we destroy that potential creativity that could be there.
Yeah. And again, I mean, alignment doesn't mean everyone's the same. It just means that they're working together for a common purpose, and how to gain that while still recognizing what those differences may be. And this comes even more to the forefront when we talk about alignment across an ecosystem. Each individual organization will bring its own purpose, but they're finding some common purpose collectively. But they also need to be aware of what the differences are among the purposes, so that they can think about new possibilities or potentials where their purposes may diverge to such a point where they're no longer alignable.
Also, if I can bring, is it Manoj? I hope I've said his name correctly.
That's right. Thank you.
Would you like to express a little bit more about what you say here in the chat?
But basically, alignment, like as Ross mentioned, the organization needs to evolve as a systemic entity for end-to-end. But you need to have like psychological safety for employees to actually come up with the EDIB, which I mentioned, is mainly bringing everything together: equality, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So you need to bring all that together, and it's just giving an environment for people to nurture and build. So the high level of purpose for profit, I sit within a non-profit organization. So whenever we talk about profit, you need to align to not monetary terms. So it's more bringing what does the organization stand for its purpose, and it's just aligning people towards how to achieve it. And during the VUCA world, which we are in now. So that's what I meant.
Yeah. Oftentimes we think very narrow, and it's much bigger. And it's not until you step back to start to think about, what are we doing, and what needs to be aligned. What are all the different aspects, of it? Becomes very different.
And it's a systemic way of, you need to start somewhere, and it's an ongoing continuous improvement process, and nobody can be fully defined, but you just reiterate and improve on whatever you currently do.
Right. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this alignment and this psychological safety that you mentioned here in your chat, you just explained. What I find is when you go into an organization, what's happening is typically a microcosm of what's happening at the board level or the most senior level. And if there's no alignment here, and this is the classic sort of hearts and minds, it's not just the technical alignment of what they're trying to achieve as shareholder value or some non-profit outcome. The people have to believe in each other as a team across the organization. And if that's not there, then the rest of the organization will never be aligned, irrespective of which way that we approach alignment, whether it's through the futocratic way or the traditional hierarchical bureaucracy. And so this alignment, I think, is really, really underestimated in terms of its importance, and it links to what we were talking about yesterday in terms of power, because very often power, individual power, and the needs of the individual often get in the way of this alignment because they are coming at it from a different psychological perspective.
Yeah. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, Tim.
Okay.
Tim, let's pick up on your point here. Welcome back. I hope it wasn't a disaster, your urgent meeting.
I think we've resolved it for the time being.
Good. So you're aligned on a solution.
Yeah.
Would you like to expand on what you've just said on the chat?
Yeah, I mean, when you're trying to get organizational alignment and everybody, heading in the same direction, that can be compromised by some of the performance management systems that exist within organizations, and the appraisal systems and the reward systems that reward individuals for their individual effort. And that can, often the objectives that an individual is pursuing is mutually exclusive to what someone else in the organization is trying to achieve. So I had an experience where I was, as a consultant, supporting a manufacturing client. And on one hand, the plant itself was being targeted with trying to reduce, basically speed up throughput, increase the amount of throughput and reduce the amount of waste. But on the procurement side, they were being charged with reducing the cost of buying in materials. Yeah. And in particular, they wanted to change the cardboard supplier, the cardboard boxes supplier. And they managed to do that and saved, a shed load of money. But unfortunately, it wasn't to spec. It kept getting stuck in the machinery. It kept, waste went up, breakdowns went down, and it just had a terrible effect. And that's just a classic case of different parts of the organization pursuing what on the face of it seem legitimate objectives, but they're not in any way complementary.
Yeah. I mean, this personal objectives is very often, particularly in Europe, linked to the salary, where you can have anything up to 80% of your salary based on this approach. And so that sort of concentrates your mind on your individual needs rather than the collective needs. And so I really support what you're saying there.
And it's particularly common in sales environments, of course, where what you sell is the most important. So if you promise a potential customer that, we can provide this for you because that's part of my sales targets, but actually the manufacturing capability doesn't exist, or the operational capability, or the logistics capability, and it puts inordinate pressure on the rest of the business to subsequently deliver what's been promised to a customer.
And a traditional performance management system basically sets up those potential conflicts. And then when the conflicts do occur, they're basically open fighting because there's no mechanism to resolve them other than fight them out openly in a performance management meeting without a way to go back and review and change the metrics because they're already locked in.
Yeah. This leads to what you were talking about, the tree of objectives, Ross, earlier, but these are discussed in isolation in these silos. Right. Janet, you've raised the issue around about adjusting things through the purpose alignment team. Would you like to explain that in a little bit more detail?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Now, I'm working with a client who is a VP in a pharma startup, and they're growing and growing and growing, and they have this VP forum that, the convening idea, is the purpose for that forum. And everything was going great. And then some market stuff has happened, and now they have to constrict, now they have some constraints and constrictions coming on. And my client is having to figure out, how do she's the informal leader of the forum. So her struggle is, how do I keep this group with their view on the long view of the enterprise view of things when everybody's current reality is they're having to pull back on their plans for 2022. Mm-hmm. And it's a group that this is a new practice for them. It's not a mature organization. These people are figuring this out and having to do this process, and they were just getting rolling on it, and now this constriction has happened, and they just don't have the practice of doing it. So I thought, I was just asking the question of you, can you speak to how does an organization, when they have like a purpose alignment team, but they're just not very good at it? Can you speak to how you deal with that?
I think they're one of many. Ross, do you want to say anything? I've got a couple of points. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, part of it is part of it is having to learn how to do it. And it's hard to give them advice other than maybe directional. Okay, one thought is, are they openly talking about the challenges? And are they doing so with a recognition of the different timeframes and the implications of those timeframes? They're dealing with a short-term problem, but at the same time, they don't want to take unnecessary actions on that situation that would hinder them long-term. And if they can then address that from a, what can we do short-term and not hinder the long-term, that might change the firefighting of the short-term. And then look at individual components of how everything fits together and what's really, impacting. A lot of times, then if you involve the people who are impacted, a critical opportunity is ask them for suggestions. And I've seen situations on this where the people who are involved sometimes come up with very creative opportunities that might have not otherwise been thought about, of where they're willing to take maybe a little bit of personal pain because of the bigger situation, but they're willing to basically volunteer that, which is very different from that being mandated or even asked. Reg,
Okay.
Your thoughts?
Yeah, before I give my thoughts, Tim, have you got any thoughts on that question?
I had to take a caller, so I missed part of the explanation, but I've been reading your notes and listening to the responses there, Janet. I mean, the whole business of prioritization in any organization seems to me to be fraught with danger. Just even an individual trying to prioritize their own workload is tough enough. To try and do that collectively is really tough. And I think that the more we can provide prioritization frameworks to enable group discussion about what really is top of the list and what should we be all collectively pursuing, then I think that that's helpful. So there are a couple of things that certainly in my practice I tend to use. The notion of the the critical reference question. I don't know if people have come across that. Would anyone know what I'm talking about when I talk about the critical reference question?
I don't know.
Maybe. Okay, so the critical reference question emerged from in the UK, from the UK rowing team, and the UK rowing team had been very unsuccessful for many years, but then they got a new coach, and the new coach changed the whole strategy. The result was that, practically for the last 10-15 years, the UK rowing team is constantly winning golds at every tournament. And one of the things that they changed is they came up with this concept of the critical reference question. And that was, for the rowing team, the question was, will it make the boat go faster? That was the question. And the idea was that everybody involved in the operation of the UK rowing team, whenever they were about to do anything or to make any decision, had to come back to that critical reference question. Will it make the boat go faster? Should we go for a drink after training? Well, will it make the boat go faster tomorrow? Maybe not. Okay, I think probably let's go and have a glass of water and sit in the fresh air or do something different. Yeah. And it was a way of really focusing people's minds on what are we actually here to do. And I think if people, an organization, teams, individual teams within the organization, but if the organization has one of those critical reference questions, it can really focus people's minds and help them make good decisions, because you can't be making collective decisions all day long. There are days when you're out doing your job and things happen and you've got to make an on-the-spot decision. Can't call a meeting and decide, go through that process. So the critical reference question is something that's always there, nagging, saying, let me just check against that. So that's one key one. Moscow is something I use a lot. I don't know if people use Moscow as a simple tool, which is to clarify what must we do, what are we absolutely committing to, because we must do it. Once we've done that, what should we do? You know, if we've got any spare capacity, what should we do? And finally, what will we do? What won't we do? What are we absolutely just disregarding? Yeah. So it's just a way of clarifying. The other one is what could we do? Yeah. So what must we do? What should we do? What could we do? Yeah. So it's worth thinking about, but we're not going to prioritize it at this stage. And what won't we do? So tools like that can just help give people a sense of perspective as to what they are trying to achieve at the more global level can help them make sensible decisions on a day-to-day basis, what they're doing at a more local level. That's just a suggestion.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks. I mean, Janet, I'll just add a couple of points here. For me, one of the things is most organizations tend to have this causation linear thinking process. And the long term is a long way down the line on this linear approach. And whereas the entrepreneur sort of effectuation approach is, I think, quite important in the situation that you're mentioning here. In the first instance is what resources do we have? So are they getting less or more? Are they static? What is the situation? And how do we use those resources to achieve what we now need to achieve? And what are the risks? If we look at the risks in a slightly different way, in the sense of what can we afford to lose? And risk, when people are looking in this sort of causation, they try to reduce risk or try and hide it off to somebody else with insurance or whatever. But if we actually say, well, what can we afford to lose? And then linking into the sorts of models that Tim has mentioned there, we then start to look at the situation differently. So if going into the future we need more resources, but we don't have the money to do that, let's use money as the means of getting resources, then we start to get into the things that we really need to do and so forth, and start to look at the risks of this. And if you're looking at your customer side, I always come back to the NICE model, the needs, interests, concerns, and expectations. And if you do that in relation to your customers and of yourself as an organization, what do we need? What are our interests? What are our concerns and expectations now? What will they be in the future that we can best test now? And how does this relate to those needs, interests, concerns, and expectations of the customers? And it's quite surprising how that very simple set of 4 questions, how powerful that is. And you sort of just pull it all together, and you get the group working together on this, and they start to reframe their views then quite quickly. So I don't know if that helps with your question.
Yeah, it does. It does. No, because it's, we were working together yesterday, so today is very timely for me. And it's, and it's the, my question to the client was, what needs to be addressed,
Mm-hmm.
And try to, really focus in on, with all the whirlwind going on around everybody right now, when you, really dig in and say, and decide what really needs to be addressed, the reframing of perspectives and the pivoting and that kind of stuff, I think really speaks to what needs to happen. Mm-hmm. And what needs to be addressed is people's frame of references or points of view or whatever need to adjust. and when everybody is protecting what they already have and trying to grab any resource that they can to achieve all these 2022 goals that are now needing to be dramatically adjusted, everybody's trying to grab anything they can so they can get at least something done that they thought they were going to be able to do.
Yeah.
So there is an element of silo, but they all recognize that. Yeah, we do have to work together, but can I be on top first, kind of stuff.
Can I respond to that and just pick up on the comment that was made previously by Manoj about psychological safety, and also linking in, Reg, with your NICE model there, and talking about interests. That is that a lot of discussion happens in organizations where people present their position, their stated position.
Absolutely.
But until you actually dig down to try and understand what are their underlying interests, what's driving that position, you're not really getting anywhere. It's very much a surface conversation, and you're not really delivering commitment either. So people are talking up at this level, they're not really signing up to anything because their underlying interests are actually taking precedence. And of course, with psychological safety, that's when people feel more comfortable declaring what their underlying interests are. So until we get them on the table, we're just wasting time with idle chat, fundamentally.
Yeah, and very often when we make these analyses and we make assumptions, for example, about our customers, we tend to look at our customer from our point of view when we're looking at what their needs are and so forth. But if we actually say, well, if we were our customer, what are their needs? And their needs are to be on time for their customers. And their interests and concerns are related to their customers, not the supplier. And we often forget that. And so the supplier in the B2B world is meeting the end customer needs, not necessarily only their direct customer needs. And these are the sorts of discussions that I find are very helpful in helping groups of people who are fighting for their turf to get a better common understanding. And then you can start to ask them, what are your expectations of each other in achieving this? And that is a very powerful process when you say, well, Reg, what's your expectation of Ross? And then Ross will say, well, actually, that expectation is not what I thought it was. I thought you wanted so-and-so. And so you start to get a different dialogue between the people. And this is when you start to get your collaboration and your alignment.
Yep. I'm thinking about this also in that if they're fighting for prioritization, they're basically fighting and not working together. And this is where, as Reg was saying, you need to change the conversation. And he also mentioned effectuation. And I pulled up a presentation I made last year on effectuation. As a startup, this may fit really well because effectuation is basically the theory of successful entrepreneurship. It comes from a study of what differentiates successful startups from those that are not successful. And when you get to the heart of it, there's a series of principles of how they view their business. And in many times, a startup, when it moves through the growth cycle and starts to go to a traditional hierarchy, these startup success factors are really lost along the way. And when an organization wants to be successful after being stodgy and slow, if they think about these principles of effectuation, they then start to think about their business differently. And I'll send you a link to last year's presentation, but basically it's a way to think differently. So for example, instead of thinking about your goals and looking at the resources, see, that's what they're doing now. They're looking at their goals and they're fighting among the resources for those goals. Flip that around and look at what your means are, what you've got now, and what can you do with that? So goals become secondary to what you've got at the means. Okay. Then also it gets into partnerships. Okay. What are the partnerships that you can do, which basically is a way to supplement the means that you've got. Okay. If you're running into other problems where you're limited, a lot of times this is where a strategic resource is the partnerships that you've got on hand or on deck. the different companies, the different relationships that you know that might be able to come in and play a part, but you don't know in advance until the opportunity comes. Okay. Then a critical component here of effectuation is focus on what you can control and ignore what you can't. Because if you focus on what you can't control, all you do is argue and get disappointed. So it's a different mindset on focusing on what you can control. And then the last part of effectuation gets into risk-taking itself. How much risk can you take if the loss is affordable? It's a completely different version of traditional risk management. Risk management looks at an expected loss and expected value and will make a return on investment relative to that. This looks as a more of a high-level risk-taking if you can accept the loss. If you can't accept the worst case, then you take it. And then you do a sensing along the way, and to the extent that you recognize that that worst case may be coming, then you cut your losses quickly. But even if you can't cut your losses totally, the losses are acceptable because that is basically built in up front. It's a different way of thinking about risk. So these are, like I said, the principles of effectuation, which is successful entrepreneurship, but it's not so much the principles, but the way you think about the problems.
Thanks, guys. This is really helpful. I'm gonna look really smart the next time we talk.
I'll give you a link to the presentation last year on effectuation, so you can watch that video.
I hope you haven't been drowned in ideas.
No, this is true. I kind of feel like I've hogged the airtime.
I mean, we've still got Haley, Caroline, and Oliver, who I'm sure also have ideas to help and support you here.
Since we're talking about rowing, we just finished talking about drowning.
Yeah.
I do like the metaphor of this tiny ship of order in this vast sea of chaos.
Yeah.
So when we think about direction, the idea of that we're going to build this railroad track to this fixed destination point, I don't think works anymore. We got to navigate this sea of uncertainty.
Absolutely.
And when we say that, we need to really provide a map that we can give to our PAT. So we got to equip them with tools. And my suggestion, that's what we're going to do in the next presentation, is talk about giving them the ability to help those decision makers focus by putting a map in front of them of the current reality and saying, where are those things that you see, Ross, things we can't control, what we can't control. And instead of doing premature convergence, let's keep things open for a while and just take, one sort of step at a time as opposed to some perfect vision. Because I think this, as a startup, you quickly find out that perfect vision head ain't there anymore. So you do have to pivot. And you need that map, and then take those, as we talked about yesterday, those little small trial and error experiments to do something, then look back to see what happened, and then your map changes, and you make your progress along those ways.
This whole concept of what can we or can't we control, people tend to, I think, they sell themselves a little short because they say, well, we can't predict the future. Well, that's not quite true, because there are many things that we know will happen, whether it's a new law coming in, whether it's the fact that the laws are computing. We know that some parts will get cheaper and the power will get stronger and so forth. So there are many things that we know are certain in the future. But there are many sort of might-be's along that journey. And we can't change the things that are fixed in the future. We may be able to make opportunities out of them. But the things that are the maybes, that's where we can go and we can create that world, because they're where many opportunities exist, because those maybes, we create those into certainties. And we often misunderstand this. And I'll give you a very quick example of a student of mine's a few years ago. There was a new law coming in Austria with everybody had to print receipts for cash sales over a certain amount of money. which meant that there would be thousands and thousands of businesses that would need to issue these new receipts. One-man shows, one-woman shows, minor doctor practices, all sorts. And this student thought, well, that's quite an idea for a startup business. So he created a business of supplying the software and the printers and everything you need for small businesses to react very quickly to this new law. And he then went around all these companies, and he had gained more than half of the Austrian market before the big companies woke up to this opportunity. So he had already created dominance in that market because he looked at the fixed points in the future that he knew were going to happen and made that into an opportunity. And we often forget that. And so when you're working with these people and they're fighting their turfs, try and help them see things slightly differently. And it's amazing what you can achieve.
I was just going to say that scenario planning is something that isn't undertaken enough within organizations and within teams, really considering, what's out there, what could happen, what might happen, and ensuring that their strategy is robust enough to be able to handle what's coming down the road or what might occur, or even to be able to reshape it, like you say, have more control than they might think they've got. I just wanted to add about, because I know VUCA's been referenced by a couple of people. I think another problem that we have is that we try to fight VUCA, when in actual fact we might as well just embrace it. This is it. And one thing that I would say is I'm quite happy to live in a VUCA world, and because what's the alternative where everything is absolutely stable and clear and mapped out? I mean, it would drive me absolutely nuts. So
boring.
Absolutely. Yeah. So although it presents challenges, it is what it is. And so we need to find better sophisticated ways to roll with it.
You're not going to stop it. Yeah. And to the extent that you try to suppress it, the pressures just build.
Good old King Canute comes to mind. Okay. Are there any other points that you would like to raise? Oliver, you've been very quiet. Is there anything that you would like to raise here?
Yeah, I just fixed this. So I listened attentively. I'm a practitioner. My work is at the intersection of project management and change management. And following some of the comments I overheard, what reminded me of is that I was a couple of years ago in a job where getting alignment of a cross-matrix team representing diverse parts of the organization, from technology to marketing to service delivery and others, typically took through 3 or 4 meetings, was rarely ever free of conflict. And clearly there were at play many of the factors that some of you have mentioned. But the one additional problem that I think is worthwhile examining in these scenarios, and which was applicable to that particular situation, is that the 2 guys on top, the heads of those teams, namely operations and technology, those were the 2 most dominant teams driving change. Those 2 guys didn't get along.
Yeah.
And that trickled down into those teams, right? So if there is conflict between 2 or more teams that need to get on the same page on any subject, one other place to look, I think, is in the senior leadership and whether they get along or not.
Absolutely. The fish rots at the head.
Yeah.
I always find when I get called into an organization and someone says, well, Reg, all my managers are arguing in the corridors. Nobody can agree anything. It's just chaos. Please just sort it out. And I say, hang on, stop. Let's have a chat with the senior management. Because if this is what's happening in your organization, this is also happening at the top. And as you say, Oliver, if you don't sort that out, you'll never, ever solve the rest. And this is the classic old OD, isn't it? Where I get my cup of tea out and I sit down and I just listen and ask sort of questions. And it's, for me, the only thing you can do initially. And so how did you solve it in your situation?
Well, repeat meetings, which obviously eats into efficiency, right? It takes a lot of time to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it periodically required escalations, which just led to more fighting between the two top guys along the lines what you mentioned. I have left this organization in the meantime, and I think the systemic structural problem there was that the two guys on top were at the same level of leadership, influence, and authority, but one was reporting into Europe and the other one was reporting into the US.
Yeah.
So it was a structural issue. Had they both reported to the same manager, I think there could have been a chance that, this could have been resolved. But last thing I will say, these problems that I just described, they were only one manifestation of this separated reporting line. I think the organization is simply not set up correctly.
Yeah. I mean, this was a classic Elliot Jakes that in a requisite organization, you should never have two people on the same level with the same power. It's irresolvable.
Well, you need the chief operating officer and you need a chief information officer, right?
Yeah.
But structurally in that organization, those guys reporting into two different directions, but both of them supporting the US business, that just didn't work very well and led to territorial behavior and conflict over priorities, resourcing, and all of that, and ended up in interpersonal animosities that didn't get resolved. So,
Good, thank you. Anything else, Ross or Gary?
No, I think
Anybody
it
else?
was a good conversation. And again, I think alignment is something that we often talk about but don't think about. Any other comments from any attendees? And Tim and Janet, I will give you a link to the effectuation webinar that I did last year. I'll put that in the replies to this event and tag you in my link. Okay. Anything else for today?
Good, thank
If
you.
not, okay. Thank you. And have a good day and see you around the network. Bye-bye.
See you later, Gary, on your presentation.
Okay, see you.
Cheers, and bye.